Welcome back. This week we are starting the section of the book on theology. Now, that's kind of a really big umbrella term. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the Trinity, so the nature of the God in the sense of the three personal God, and kind of exploring what that means. And then later on we will be looking at mankind's relationship to God. So, the first thing Lewis says is people are often put off by theology. It's too complicated, it's too deep, just give us plain old religion. And Lewis says, I don't blame people for saying this. And he has this story where he went and gave a series of talks to, I think it was like an army base, like an army camp. And after he gave the lectures, he had an old Air Force officer come up to him and told Lewis, I've no use for all that stuff, but mind you, I'm a religious man too. I know there's a God. I've felt him out alone in the desert at night. The tremendous mystery. And that's just why I don't believe all your neat little dogmas and formulas about him. To anyone who's met the real thing, they all seem so petty and pedantic and unreal. And Lewis says, in one sense, I quite agree with that old man. I think he probably did have a real experience with God out in the desert. And when he turned from that experience to the Christian creeds, he was, in fact, turning from something more real to something less real. In the same way, if you are sitting on the beach looking at the Atlantic, and then you go inside and look at a map of the Atlantic, you are also moving from something more real to something less real. You're going from real waves, real water, to a bit of colored paper. But here's the point. While the map is admittedly only a bit of colored paper, it has two things in its favor. First, it's based on the experiences of thousands of people really sailing the Atlantic. And so it has masses of experiences behind it, just as real as your own. But secondly, if you want to get anywhere, you must use the map. If you are content with just walks on the beach, your own view is more fun. But the map is more useful if you want to get across the ocean. Lewis says, now, theology is like the map. Merely learning and thinking about the Christian doctrines, if you stop there, is less real and less exciting than the sort of thing my friend got in the desert. Doctrines are not God. They are only a kind of map. But the map is based on the experience of hundreds of people who really were in touch with God. And secondly, if you want to get any further, you must use the map. You see, what happened to that man in the desert may have been real, and it was certainly exciting. But nothing comes of it. It leads nowhere. There's nothing to do about it. In fact, that is just why a vague religion, all about feeling God and nature and so on, is so attractive. It's all thrills and no work, like watching waves from the beach. But you will not get to Newfoundland by studying the Atlantic that way. And you will not get eternal life by simply feeling the presence of God in flowers or music. Neither will you get anywhere by looking at maps without going to sea. Nor will you be very safe if you go to sea without a map. In other words, theology is practical. So, how do we get theology? We're going to have to look at Christianity, read the Bible, and actually really think about what it says. Well, what does it say? It says that Christ is the Son of God, whatever that means. It says that we can also be sons of God if we bind ourselves to Christ, whatever that means. It says that his death has saved us from sin, whatever that means. Now, it's no good complaining that these statements are difficult. Christianity claims to be telling us about another world. It's going to be just as complicated as modern physics, and for the same reason. Lewis thinks the biggest shock out of the whole Bible is the sentiment that if we can attach ourselves to Christ, we can also be sons of God. Now, this is a sentiment that confuses some people who say, aren't we children of God already? Well, in one sense, yes. In the sense that God brought us into existence and loves us and looks after us. And so in that way, he is like a father. But when the Bible talks about us, good morning. When the Bible talks about us becoming sons of God, it must mean something else. One of the creeds says, Christ, the Son of God, begotten, not created. And then it goes on to say, begotten before all worlds. We'll come back to that before all worlds in a future week, but right now we want to look at Christ, Son of God, begotten, not created. We don't use the word beget anymore, but we hopefully all still know what it means. You find in the Old Testament when Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob. Beget means to become the father of someone. Now here's what's the important distinction we want to draw. When you beget, you make something like yourself. A man begets human babies. A beaver begets little beavers. A bird begets little birds through eggs. Now, when you create, you make something unlike yourself. A beaver creates a dam. A bird builds a nest. A man makes a radio. Or he could make something more like a man, like a statue. If he's a talented man, he could make a very lifelike statue. But it's still just a statue. It's not alive. So we want to get this clear. What God begets is God, just like what man begets is man. What God creates is not God, just like what man creates is not man. That is why we are not sons of God like Christ is. We may be like God in a sense that we'll get into, but we are still only statues or pictures. A statue has the shape of a man, but it is not alive. In the same way, man has, in a sense, the shape or likeness of God. In the Genesis, it says we're made in the image of God. But he has not got the kind of life that God has. Now, everything God has made has some likeness to himself. Space is like him in its hugeness. Not that the greatness of space is the same kind of the greatness of God's, but it is a sort of symbol of it, or translation of it into non-spiritual terms. Matter is like God, because it has energy. Though, once again, physical energy is a different kind of thing from the power of God. The vegetable world is like him because it is alive, and he is the living God. But life, in this biological sense, is not the same as the life there is in God. It is only a kind of symbol or shadow of it. When we come on to the animals, we find other kinds of resemblances. The intense activity and fertility of the insects, for example, is a first dim resemblance of the unceasing activity and the creativeness of God. In the higher mammals, we get the beginnings of instinctive affection. That is not the same thing as the love that exists in God, but it is like it. Rather in the way that a picture drawn on a flat piece of paper can nevertheless be like a landscape. When we come to man, the highest of the animals, we get the completest resemblance to God which we know of. Man not only lives, but loves and reasons. Biological life reaches its highest known level in him. But what man, in his natural condition, has not got is spiritual life, the higher and different sort of life that exists in God. Now, it's kind of unfortunate that we use the word life to refer to both biological life and spiritual life. So what we're going to do is give them two distinct names, or rather Lewis is going to. We're going to call the first one bios, which is where we get the word biology, to refer to natural life. We're going to use the word zoe to refer to spiritual life. And these are both Greek words, and we recognize the word bios from the word biology. And it took me a little bit of research, but zoe is also a Greek word that means life, and it's what Christ used when he identified himself as the way, the truth, and the life. Now, bios, your natural life, is always running out, decaying. It runs out eventually. But Zoe is forever. Lewis says bios has a certain shadowy or symbolic resemblance to Zoe, but only the sort of resemblance there is between a photo and a place, or a statue and a man. A man who changed from having bios to having Zoe would have gone through as big a change as a statue which changed from being a carved stone to being a real man. And that is precisely what Christianity is about. This world is a great sculptor's shop. We are their statues, and there is a rumor going round the shop that someday some of us are going to come to life. So that's chapter 1, Making and Begetting. We're now going to jump into chapter 2, the three-personal God. So we said, God begets Christ, but he only makes men. When you beget something, you make something like yourself, which is... So we're going to explore the idea of the Trinity here. And so God begets Christ. And so in that way, it's like a human father begetting a human child. But it's not quite like it. So we're going to explore it now in a bit of a different direction. Lewis says, a good many people nowadays say, I believe in a God, but not in a personal God. They feel that the mysterious something which is behind all other things must be somehow more than a person. Now, the Christians quite agree. But the Christians are the only people who offer any idea of what a being that is beyond personality could be like. All the other people, though they say that God is beyond personality, really think of him as something impersonal. That is, something less than a person. When you push these people, Lewis will say later, when you really push these people and dig them for an analogy, what do you think God is really like? You get descriptions like a vast permeating cloud, an endless ocean, light going on forever and ever. But all these things are less than person. If you are looking for something super personal, something more than a person, then it is not a question of choosing between the Christian idea or the other ideas. The Christian idea is the only one on the market. Now, Lewis says, I want you to follow closely because we're going to kind of jump ship here and it's going to sound like a weird tangent, but we'll bring it back around eventually. So, we live in 3 dimensions. Left, right is 1, up, down is 2, back, forth is 3. Now, if you work in 1 dimension, you can really only, let's say right to left, you can really only make a line. If you work in 2 dimensions, say left, right, and up, down, you can make a shape, say a square. And if you work in 3 dimensions, like what we exist in, you can make a 3-dimensional figure, say a cube. The next thing that's important to take note of is you might notice that your 2-dimensional shape, your square, is made out of 1-dimensional lines. And your 3-dimensional cube is made out of 2-dimensional squares. As you move up to the more complicated levels, you don't leave behind the earlier things. You find them combined and organized in new ways. Well, this is the same principle that the Christians advocate. The human level is simple. When you have 1 person, they are 1 being, and any 2 people are 2 different beings. Just like if you're working on a piece of paper, and it's 2-dimensional, any 2 squares are 2 distinct figures. On the divine level, you still find personalities, but combined in new ways. God is 3 persons while still being 1 being. Just like a cube is 6 squares, but it's still 1 figure. Now, the immediate response to this is, well, we can't really conceive of what it'd be like to have 3 persons in 1 entity. Just like we can't conceive of what a 4-dimensional cube would be. Which, fun fact, the name of that is a tesseract. maybe it's not a fun fact, random trivia of the day. So if you have a square is 2-dimensional, a cube is 3-dimensional, the family of squares, a 4-dimensional would be called a tesseract. Anyways. So we can't really understand what a 3-dimensional personality would be like. You may ask, if we cannot imagine a 3-personal being, what is the good of talking about him? Well, there isn't any good talking about him. The thing that matters is being actually drawn into that 3-personal life. What I mean is this. An ordinary, simple Christian kneels down to say his prayers. He is trying to get in touch with God. But if he is a Christian, he knows that what is prompting him to pray is also God. God, so to speak, inside him. But he also knows that all his real knowledge of God comes through Christ, the man who was God. That Christ is standing beside him, helping him to pray, praying for him. You see what is happening? God is the thing to which he is praying, the goal he is trying to reach, God the Father. God is also the thing inside him which is pushing him on, Holy Spirit, the motive power. God is also the road or bridge along which he is being pushed to that goal, Christ. So that the whole threefold life of the 3-personal being is actually going on in that ordinary little bedroom where an ordinary man is saying his prayers. That is how theology got started. People already knew about God in a vague way. Then came a man who claimed to be God. And yet he was not the sort of man you could dismiss as a lunatic. He made them believe him. They met him again after they had seen him killed. And then, after they had been formed into a little society or community, they found God somehow inside them as well, directing them, making them able to do things they could not do before. And when they worked it all out, they found they had arrived at the Christian definition of the 3-personal God. Now there's a bit more to that chapter, but I find it's not very dense. It's a lot of language to really convey the idea that the only adequate instrument for learning about God is the whole Christian community. Lewis talks about using scientific equipment to observe the natural world, and if you have bad equipment, you get bad results. Now that's not a result of nature being unfair. A dirty mirror reflects light worse than a clean mirror. That's not the sun being unfair. So we're going to kind of jump through the rest of that chapter because I would like to jump into chapter 3, Time and Beyond Time. Now once again, we're going to kind of jump into a new idea here. Now Lewis starts out by saying that this idea that we're going to talk about now is he puts in quotes, Christian idea. And the reason it's in quotes is because while great and wise Christians have held it, and there's nothing contrary to it in Christianity, it's not in the Bible. The problem was presented to Lewis as this. I can believe in God all right, but what I cannot swallow is the idea of him attending to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I have found that quite a lot of people feel this. Lewis identifies the problem being in the phrase, at the same moment. Most people would have no problem imagining God dealing with prayers and petitions if they came to him one by one, and if he had an endless amount of time to address them in. The difficulty comes in trying to fit too many things into one moment. After all, that's what happens to us. Life comes to us moment by moment, and we don't get to have the next one until the previous one has left. And there's very little time in each to do anything. That is, just technically speaking, what time is for you and me. And it's very easy to take for granted that this is how time works for the whole universe and for God. However, the Christian start of it, and eventually the philosophers agreed, And now even the physicists are starting to talk about the idea that there may be some things that aren't in time. Almost certainly, Lewis says, God is not in time. His life does not consist of moments following one another. If 1 million people are praying to him at 10:30 tonight, he need not listen to them all in that one little snippet we call 10:30. 10:30 and every other moment from the beginning of the world is always the present to him. If you like to put it that way, he has all eternity to listen to the split second of prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes in flames. Here's an analogy Lewis says that might help. Imagine Lewis is writing a story, and he writes the sentence, Mary laid down her work. Next moment came a knock at the door. From Mary's point of view, those two moments are consecutive. She put down her work. Next moment came a knock at the door. But Lewis, who is writing this story, what if he wrote it like this? What if he typed, Mary laid down her work, and then he stopped? He could get up. He could think about Mary for an hour or more and think about her worries, her desires, who she is as a character. He could go in the other room and have a cup of tea. He could go read earlier chapters. He could think about the end of the book. And then hours later, come back, sit down, and write the line, next moment came a knock at the door. From Mary's point of view, the two moments are consecutive. But this illustration breaks down because the author gets out of one timeline, that is the timeline of the story, only by getting into another, that is the real world timeline. Lewis says that he does not believe God is in a time series at all. You see, to have a past means you have lost something. You don't have access to it anymore. It's in the past. And have a future means that there are some things that you don't have yet. They're not available to you yet. They're still in the future. God is too complete to have a past or a future. He can't have lost anything. He can't have anything that he doesn't have access to yet. There's no way for him to still grow, to learn. There's nothing in the future for God. He's too complete to have lost anything. Now, the idea is worth trying to grasp because it removes some apparent difficulties in Christianity. Everyone who believes in God at all believes that he knows what you and I are going to do tomorrow. But if he knows what I'm going to do so-and-so, how can I be free to do otherwise? Well, here once again, the difficulty comes from thinking that God is progressing along the timeline like us, the only difference being that he can see ahead and we cannot. Well, if that were true, if God foresaw our acts, it would be very hard to understand how we could not be free to do them. But suppose God is outside and above the timeline. In that case, what we call tomorrow is visible to him in just the same way as what we call today. All the days are now for him. He does not remember you doing things yesterday. He simply sees you doing them. Because though you have lost yesterday, he has not. He does not foresee you doing things tomorrow. He simply sees you doing them. Because though tomorrow is not yet there for you, it is for him. You never suppose that your actions at this moment were any less free because God knew what you were doing. Well, he knows your tomorrow's actions in just the same way, because he is already in tomorrow and can simply watch you. In a sense, he does not know your action until you have done it. But then the moment at which you have done it is already now for him. Now, like we said at the beginning of this chapter, there's nothing contrary to Christianity in this idea, but it's not in the Bible. You can be a good Christian without accepting it or even thinking about the question at all. Now, I know we jumped around to a couple big ideas today, and that was kind of heavy. The reason is that we are laying a foundation for future weeks. So probably the ideas that you want to really get in your head were the ideas that we talked about, the difference between begetting, where you make something like yourself, and making, or creating, where you make something unlike yourself. We talked about bios versus zoe, which is biological or natural life versus spiritual life. And finally, the idea of statues coming to life. I like the idea of Pinocchio, a little wooden puppet becoming a real boy. Next week, we're going to read chapter 4, Good Infection, chapter 5, The Obstinate Toy Soldiers, and chapter 6 is just titled Two Notes. But for now, that's all I have to say about that.